High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
This is part of what made Donald Trump so mad. A $75 million ad campaign by Ontario that plays snippets of a speech by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Trump posted online that the ads are a fraud, misrepresenting Reagan's views. In all caps, he wrote, "Canada cheated and got caught," adding all negotiations with Canada were terminated, and leaving Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was about to get on a plane to Asia, in the lurch.
For months, we have stressed the importance of distinguishing things we can control and things we can't control.
I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, we've got a Canadian who worked on free trade with Ronald Reagan. Are the ads unfair? Is it smart to pull them? Plus, as Canada looks for more trade with China, former detainee Michael Kovrig has got some thoughts.
To see a prime minister or foreign minister smiling and shaking hands with people who were previously involved in taking me hostage and blackmailing the country is not comfortable.
And the Liberals' new plan to get tougher on crime. We'll ask the Justice Minister why the Liberals have struggled for years to get the rules right around who gets out on bail. But first, Trump's Reagan-related rage. The House is now in session. Let's dive right in and try to make sense of Trump's outrage over these ads featuring former president and Republican icon Ronald Reagan. Where does it leave Canada now? Let's ask someone who was part of the team that dealt a lot with the Reagan administration back in the 1980s. Derek Burney was Canada's ambassador to the U.S. from 1989 to 1993, and he was Brian Mulroney's chief of staff before that. Derek Burney, thanks for joining me.
I'm very pleased to be with you.
These ads prompted Trump to announce negotiations are over. Do you think that Doug Ford hooped the rest of Canada?
Well, no, I think if there's an overreaction, it's by the president, not by the premier. I've seen the ad. It's the Reagan voice that I'm very familiar with. I know there's some concern in the fact that it's being edited, but gee, you're in the media. Do you ever edit things? Oh, I don't think so. I shudder at thought. So I think it's a considerable overreaction on the part of the president, who blows hot and cold on almost everything. I think we shouldn't take it too seriously at the moment. I mean, he's under a lot of pressure internationally and at home, and he's under pressure on trade because the tariffs are not doing for America what he promised they would do. Affordability is a major issue in the United States. Inflation is rising, not falling. And tariffs are pointed to, as Ronald Reagan mentioned in his interview, or in his speech rather, tariffs are punishing consumers and producers. Reagan believed that fundamentally. And if it hadn't been for Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney's full commitment to free trade, we never would have got an agreement back in 1987. I mean, it was not an easy achievement. James Baker, who was my counterpart in the final round of the negotiations, wrote in his memoir that it was a near-run thing. But the thing that drove it home was the commitment from the president and the prime minister. Nobody in America is in any doubt about Ronald Reagan's views on tariffs.
So I hear you saying, the reaction is about the ads, but it's not really about the ads. It's about the broader context that Donald Trump is facing.
He's facing a Supreme Court decision, which is probably going to go against him on these same tariffs. Now, I'm not going to say that the Ontario ad is going to change the Supreme Court's decision, but it will affect the mood in America, the political mood in America, which is turning a bit sour on tariffs. They're not working as they were told they would.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how Canada deals with this moment. And I think it's been striking. We're starting to see a number of leaders line up behind Doug Ford. I'd like to play an example of that. This is Manitoba's Wab Canoe. It is a message that he posted online, and there's a video with it, and he appears on screen. You see him on sort of a retro TV set. Let's listen.
Ontario's TV ads present Ronald Reagan's views on tariffs accurately and powerfully. President Trump's damaging tariffs go completely against Mr. Reagan's legacy. And it's clear that these ads are working. If you throw a rock at a lake and you don't hear a splash, you've probably missed. So to my good friend Doug Ford, keep the ads on TV. They're effective, and this country is behind you.
It's not just Wab Kinew, BC's David Eby, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest backing Ford's ad. Do you think it's a good idea to continue airing these, Derek Burney?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We need some spine when we're dealing with a person like Donald Trump. I mean, he's a bully. We have to understand that. And how do you deal with a bully? Well, you don't put up with it. You fight back. And we have to fight back with anything that we've got. And if an ad like this provokes him, God knows what else is going to happen. But nobody in America is in any doubt about Ronald Reagan's conviction to free trade. Before we negotiated the FTA, he was calling for free trade from the Yucatan to the Yukon. He was anticipating NAFTA long before it was even being thought about. So this is not an argument that Donald Trump is going to win if he tries to debate anybody. The record is clear. And I understand the Reagan Foundation had some quibbles about it because it had been edited. What a surprise.
What do you think Ronald Reagan would make of the way Trump's handling this moment?
I think Ronald Reagan would be embarrassed by the way Donald Trump is treating his neighbor, and a neighbor that Ronald Reagan proudly embraced on not only on trade, but on national security and international foreign policy issues. Canada stood with America in a lot of areas. We didn't stand with them on Nelson Mandela and South Africa, but he didn't let that affect the overall relationship. He and Margaret Thatcher were in one camp, we were in another. That didn't affect the relationship with either. Brian Mulroney had the full respect from Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan had the full respect from Brian Mulroney. That's why things worked.
I want to talk a bit about the path forward. You said a moment ago, we need to show some spine. But if we look at the last time that Donald Trump said negotiations are over with Canada, it was around the digital services tax, and Mark Carney backed off on the tax. He made a concession. Do you think Canada will have to make some sort of concession here to appease Trump?
What more concessions we could make that we haven't already done? No, I think what Mr. Carney should do is when he's in Asia later this month, he should make it clear that we want more trade with our Asian partners. That is a good outlet for us. We cannot rely exclusively on the U.S. going forward. And if we can demonstrate that Japan, Korea, India, even China are open to further not only trade, but investment with Canada, that would be the best message Donald Trump could hear in Asia.
As you've been telling us, you were intimately involved in the creation of NAFTA. Do you worry that the future of the North American Free Trade Agreement is on the line right now?
I'm very concerned about that because not only is the president a protectionist, pro-tariff, but so are most of the Republicans in Congress. That's not the way it was in our day. The Republicans were always more pro-free trade than the Democrats. The Democrats in our day, in the 80s, were the protectionists. Interestingly enough, some of the Democrats, like the governor of Pennsylvania, is now speaking about the value of free trade. So things are shifting. The mood is shifting, and the politicians aren't where they used to be. So I worry about it. Obviously, it's a legacy that I'm very proud of, and for it to go asunder would be it's already being very damaging for Canada. We've got to find a way out of it, but I'm not going to overreact to a little petulance over a TV ad. We have bigger things at stake than advertising. We have to get to a negotiation. We have to get to a conclusive negotiation. We can't offer any bribes the way some other countries have in order to satisfy the Americans. We need to stand our ground, and we need to show quickly that we have some alternatives, not substitutes, but alternatives to shore up our trade relationship. We cannot continue to depend as heavily as we have exclusively on the United States.
When you say bribes, what do you mean?
Countries like Korea and Japan are offering investments in the United States as a way to smooth the way for a trade agreement. Well, we don't have to play that game. Our trade stands on its own. The Americans, despite what Trump says, the Americans do need our uranium. They do need our aluminum. They do need our potash. These are not things that they buy because we're Canadian. Yeah. They buy it because they need them.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Derek Burney was Chief of Staff to Brian Mulroney. To talk more about where Trump's U-turn leaves Canada now, we've got Stuart Thomson, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the National Post, and Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. We spoke Friday afternoon. Stuart, Tonda, welcome back to the House.
Hey there.
Hey.
Okay, so there were rumors that a deal on sectoral tariffs was coming possibly next week at APEC. Now we've got Trump saying Canada cheated and got caught. The negotiations are off. Doug Ford is doubling down. Stuart, does this make any sense?
Well, if you look at the history of U.S. President Donald Trump, it certainly does make sense. And as a reporter, I always try to think about all of the previous convulsions that we've had and
That's a good word for
how
it.
many of them actually mattered in the long run. And it's, I'd say maybe 10% of them actually mattered. It is exciting. It is disconcerting. It is worrying. But I think you sometimes have to take a breath when Trump does something like this.
Tonda?
I was reminded of the G7 in 2018 when Trump blew up the whole final communique and stormed off in his plane, tweeting, rage tweeting at Justin Trudeau. And we were all scratching our heads trying to figure out what was that about. But I hesitate to say it's par for the course. And it certainly it didn't wake me up. Unfortunately, I was still awake when it happened. So, it sent me madly filing for the next several hours.
It's par for the course if it is a Donald Trump golf course, I would say. It's the only place where it's par for the course. An interesting element of this is also the sort of Ontario federal dynamic, Tonda. I mean, you just have to think back to, I think it was Thursday, Mark Carney and Doug Ford right there. They were at a news event together, flattering each other. Carney's like, hey, slugger, he said to Ford. How big a problem do you think this situation creates in the Ontario federal dynamic?
I actually don't see that there's a whole lot of tension and daylight actually between them. Doug Ford plays the bad cop and Carney lets him and praises him publicly for his good work. So this ad campaign, it will be something if we see over the next day or two or even next week whether Ontario actually pulls that ad, but there's no sign they will. Doug Ford is telling us today that and this being Friday, that he's going to air that ad tonight. So I don't see there's tension, and I think that they actually are playing off each other quite effectively.
Stuart, I think that is fascinating because not only is Doug Ford not backing down, we're starting to see a number of people backing him up. NDP Premier of Manitoba, Wab Kinew, put out a sort of online posting saying, like, keep going. Jean Charest has put up a post saying that this is the right thing to do. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it is very interesting because there is also regional dynamics here. And we had this back in March where Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was saying, hey, let's take the temperature down and let's maybe talk to them. And Doug Ford was doing his thing. And I think that still exists, even though it's a little bit more under the surface now. But I think what you'll find is this: when Donald Trump does something like this, Canadians tend to come together. And that is usually what happens. We have our disagreements, but broadly, we're going to be on the side of each other. And I think that's like what Tonda said is Carney, I think, has to do these negotiations and go to the White House. He's happy to let Ford be the bad cop because he knows Canadians need to vent, and Ford is helping them do that.
But Tonda, I mean, the ads have succeeded in making Trump angry. It's not clear.
And actually amplifying the message.
Well, this is my question. Like, to what extent is this really helping Canada's cause?
Well, we'll see. I mean, look, I think it is a different situation than it was in the first round of the trade talks in Trump's first term. There were much reduced tariffs only on two sectors. The problem for everybody right now is the stakes are so much higher. The tariffs across the board are so much higher, despite the few exemptions we have right now. Let's see if Trump follows through on his threat and does completely cut off trade talks. There's some question. He did not repeat that Friday morning when he reposted his anger. He dropped the reference to trade talks are canceled. And so let's see what happens in the days and weeks ahead. But the problem is of an order of magnitude much higher across all sectors of the Canadian economy. And so the stakes are very high for everybody. Something has to move, and soon. Will they meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit next week? We'll see. Or if it does become a meeting, and what portion of it will be public? And will Trump give Carney a dressing down in public? There are many things at play right now.
As Mark Carney, Stuart, sort of tries to figure out next steps, I mean, we had something interesting happen this week when Canada said for a couple of automakers who were pulling production and moving it to the U.S. that they were going to put in place a certain level of tariffs on Stellantis and GM. Do you think that Mark Carney is going to have to sort of pivot a bit here? Does he have to get a bit more muscular? Could there even be retaliation in response to this?
Well, if you saw, and I would say it's worth seeing, watching the video of Mark Carney on Friday morning responding to this. It was 4 minutes, 2 minutes in English, 2 minutes in French. He seemed very calm. You may say blasé, if you want to go that far.
I'm just going to jump in here. It was sort of interesting because as he walked up to the microphone, he was like making jokes about the Toronto Blue Jays, right? And I don't think that's just happenstance. That is about taking down the tone, taking down the temperature, to your point about being blasé.
And I've written a piece. I made the point that there is a case to be made, not a political case, but on sort of the substance of a trade deal for Carney to try and wait out Trump. Whoever wants to make a deal the most, usually they take the worst side of the deal. So for Carney to wait it out probably makes sense, but politically, it gets harder and harder with every day that goes by, every job that gets lost. So I think he is sort of straddling that, where he probably knows there's no rush to do this except for the fact that people are hurting. So I think that explains his demeanor a little bit.
I think that the notion that everybody should keep calm and carry on was the kind of approach that the Liberal government under Trudeau took initially when the Trump tariffs first started being imposed 10 months ago. And the idea that the longer the time went on, the harder it would be in the U.S. and consumers would bear the pain and the pain point would make itself felt. And then finally, perhaps, there would be political and corporate leadership that would step up and confront Trump. We haven't seen that. We're 10 months in. That's not working. So I think yes, a lot of people think, well, let's see how much longer this can go. But I think the political problem is very much that investment every day is making a choice to go to the U.S. If you look at what's on the White House website in terms of the list of corporate investment that's fled into the U.S. as a result of this, that's a shocking, endless ream of paper, of pages listing the losses. And Canada's going to feel some of that. And I think that the job losses in particular are real, and they're going to be way beyond the auto sector. The forestry sector in this country affects more jobs than the auto sector. It's in every community in every region.
You talk about this in part as a political problem. I want to talk now about a very different kind of political problem, which is the one that Pierre Poilievre is facing. Since Pierre Poilievre, Stuart, made those comments on a podcast referring to the RCMP leadership as despicable, he has continued to face questions about it. He has continued to face questions about how things are faring within caucus. There was reporting by Radio-Canada this week talking about the discontent of several MPs. What is your sense of how bad things are for the Conservatives?
Yeah, it kind of depends how you look at it, because I think if you're Pierre Poilievre and you're worried about some threat to your leadership, some imminent threat, that's just not there. But what you do find when you talk to Conservatives, the party members, and especially the MPs, is that there's just this kind of impotent frustration. Like things aren't going their way. They can't get into the news. The only time they do get into the news now, it's this RCMP thing where they're clarifying and then clarifying again and getting criticized. So there is real trouble in that caucus. And there are people who think we just can't win with this leader, but there's really not much they can do about it. The party members are going to back him in the leadership review almost certainly, and the caucus really has a limited means beyond that.
Tonda, it's funny. It does sort of remind me, and I'm not saying the outcome will be the same, but having covered politics, it reminds me of some of the conversation around Justin Trudeau, right? Where you see MPs within a caucus who are feeling frustrated. There were, there were rumblings in Ottawa this week. Was there going to be a floor crossing? There hasn't been one, right? But is caucus going to do something? Oh, no, they're not. Do you think this is a longer-term problem for Pierre Poilievre?
I think it's actually a longer-term problem for the Conservative Party. Pierre Poilievre's leadership review vote in January seems secure. Like Stu just said, there's nobody in the wings driving any revolt. But what I think it is, and it's raising in the minds of a lot of other people, is can Pierre Poilievre win an election? And that's the bigger problem and the bigger question for Conservative Party members.
And why is this raising that question? Like, why does this speak to that
Because
question?
it revealed and it showed that the post-election lessons that Mr. Poilievre suggested he was learning in terms of moderating some of the positions and the appeal and reaching out more broadly, it showed he was appealing to a base that perhaps has conspiracy beliefs around, the corrupt RCMP and corrupt Justin Trudeau, and they all should have been in jail. When Mr. Poilievre is parsing his own words to try and explain his way out of that, you realize that what it has done is it's raised those questions about, does he have the leadership skill to engender trust in Canadians, in public institutions, the guardians of democracy, all of that. And I think that's why this is different. It's triggered some of those doubts, and it's shown that Mr. Poilievre doesn't seem to be actually showing his work if he's learned lessons.
I think it just shows you that for Pierre Poilievre, if you put that big Justin Trudeau pinata in front of him, he will always hit it. And I think he's just hearkening back to those days when he was leading by 20 points.
Okay. Stuart, Tonda, always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stuart Thomson and Tonda MacCharles. On Friday afternoon, Ontario Premier Doug Ford released a statement saying after talking to the Prime Minister, the ads will be paused on Monday and that Ford has achieved his goal of reaching U.S. audiences at the highest level. As Trump once again flips the table with Canada on trade, the federal government has been looking at other partners, including China. It wasn't that long ago that Canadian and Chinese governments were diametrically opposed. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were released just 4 years ago after being held over 1,000 days in Chinese detention facilities. But these days, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has just returned from a visit to China and talks about the country as a strategic partner. Prime Minister Mark Carney is off on an international trip that could see him meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Are these improved ties prudent, as the Canadian government argues, or is Canada being gaslit by Chinese diplomacy? That is what my next guest says. Michael Kovrig is a former Canadian diplomat and chief executive of Kovrig Group, providing advice on geopolitical risk. I spoke with him Friday. Michael Kovrig, welcome to the House.
Thank you. Good to be here.
As we are speaking, Canada's trade relationship with the U.S. has hit once again more turbulence. With things so uncertain, why not look to China to build more trade ties?
Well, there are a lot of reasons why not to. But let's be clear, it's not a black and white situation. I think there are some things that Canada can usefully do with China and that would benefit from more stable, normalized diplomatic channels of communication. But at the same time, everything needs to be done with a great deal of caution and guardrails and general safeguards to manage all the potential downsides of that relationship.
You wrote that China was engaged in diplomatic gaslighting when it comes to Canada. Can you explain that?
Sure. So what I wanted to do with that's an article you're referring to that I wrote for the National Post, and I have a longer discussion about that on my Substack. What that's about is I think a lot of the language that China is using right now, whether Ambassador Wang Di or senior Chinese officials who have met Canada's foreign minister and met Mark Carney in New York, for example, they're using a lot of language that sounds superficially nice and friendly and warm. And that's certainly an improvement in tone from the last several years when not just with Canada, but with a slew of other countries, Chinese diplomats were pursuing a kind of really hyper-aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy in which they were being overbearing and coercive and abrasive. They've now pivoted to what some call a second charm offensive. So what I was pointing to with that article really is just to understand that this is a rhetorical shift. They're trying to change the narrative, but there's no substantive change in either the Chinese Communist Party's worldview or its interests or its objectives or what it's trying to achieve. So it's not offering to change its behavior in any way. It just wants to change the mood music. Now, that's an improvement from Canada's perspective. We'd rather be spoken to politely than yelled at or have our citizens taken hostage. But Canadians need to understand that that is just diplomatic wrapping paper. It doesn't change the fundamentals necessarily.
Well, and there's also the question of what the Canadian government understands about this moment, how they view the moment. So let's listen to what Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand told our colleagues at Power and Politics after she returned from that trip to China.
When we think about India and China and other relationships, we have to remember that it is necessary to raise issues of concern to the Canadian population. At the same time, we need to be pragmatic about our economic needs.
So she's talking about raising issues of concern, but being pragmatic. How does that balance strike you?
I mean, again, those are nice words, but ultimately it depends on how they're actually implemented. So pragmatic can mean simply looking to find a healthy balance in which Canada is able to maximize the economic benefits that it can extract from involvement with China through trade and investment, while putting up guardrails to ensure the country's economic security and to protect our society and our politics from foreign interference. The trouble is that sometimes pragmatic can kind of become a smokescreen for let's make short-term transactional decisions that deliver economic benefits, or they allow me as a politician to show wins to the public, but that over the long term could actually get the country into trouble and lead to erosions of its sovereignty and autonomy, and ultimately harm its national security. And so that's where you need to be careful. And I think that's where the complicated balance is. So one of the key points I'm trying to make is that we need our politicians and our government in general to be frank and transparent with Canadians about what the risks and potential rewards and the trade-offs are. And this is not just Canada, every country, the UK, Australia, many of our like-mindeds are all trying to find a balance. Because in some respects, from a political and a security perspective, we are in a new Cold War. But from an economic perspective, it's very different, because the West during the Cold War had virtually no trade or investment with the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc. We have significant economic relations with China, and simply cutting those off could be economically damaging to Canada, particularly in the context of everything that's going on with the United States. So the question is, how do you maintain and arguably improve selectively some economic relations with China, while ensuring that that's not creating dependency on China that the Chinese Communist Party can then exploit for leverage to compel Canadian policymakers to do things that they otherwise would not want to do?
It seems that would be a challenging balance to strike, but I wonder, given that, knowing that Prime Minister Mark Carney might meet with President Xi Jinping over the course of the next few days, what is the most important piece of advice you would give him about that meeting?
I mean, I think the key one that everybody should understand is the broader context in which Canada is trying to manage relations with China, right? China, under the Chinese Communist Party, has risen to become a peer competitor with the United States, and it's challenging it to dominate and reshape the world order. As part of that agenda, it's working to dominate its own region, support other authoritarian and revisionist powers like Russia and North Korea, including in their illegal war on Ukraine, reduce its dependence on other countries, increase other countries' dependence on China, particularly Canada in our case, weaken the United States, break up Western alliances, and divide the global West from the global South, and become the central state in a new international order. If China is successful in all those things, it's not going to be a good world for Canada. So Prime Minister Carney, as a politician, I think he understands these things as an economist and a statesman. He's well briefed by people in the government, but he needs to be able to balance the short-term pressures of a politician who needs to come back from meetings with China with some quick wins that deliver economic benefits, or that, let's say, offer some relief from Chinese tariffs. And at the same time, keep in mind that he doesn't want to be doing anything that is going to be significantly advantaging the Chinese Communist Party and helping it to implement an agenda that would ultimately be hostile not only to Canada, but to all liberal democracies and open societies, that would involve essentially weakening and breaking up the G7 and pushing all of our like-minded countries down the league table of countries so that China can reshape the international order. That's not a good world for Canada. So that's a very complicated balance.
In closing, I mean, we are talking about this in terms of the economics, the geopolitics, but I do wonder, what it is like for you personally to see Canada growing closer to China only 4 years after you were released from your imprisonment?
It's definitely it gives me mixed feelings. That's certainly true. I mean, to see a prime minister or foreign minister smiling and shaking hands with people who were previously involved in taking me hostage and blackmailing the country is not comfortable. But at the same time, I need to put aside my own personal feelings and recognize that's kind of the tragedy of geopolitics, right? Countries have to eventually move forward in relationships, that we all have to share the planet together. And so the issue with China is not somehow that, we would never talk to Chinese officials again. It's rather trying to build high-level channels and mechanisms, like, for example, mechanisms to discuss trade and investment or climate change or biodiversity or human rights, that we need those diplomatic mechanisms. Ultimately, we need diplomats not to talk to our friends, but to talk to countries that are difficult to deal with. And so to the extent that there is at least a cordial, respectful relationship that can then lead to guardrails that ultimately leads to understandings between China and Canada that certain behavior is not acceptable and will have consequences. But as long as behavior can be reasonable and follow international laws and norms, we can at least have some limited engagement that is mutually beneficial. But I think people should realize that both sides are trying to do this in a chaotic situation in which things need to be stabilized. But people that I talk to regularly inside the Canadian government are not naive about China. They understand what they're dealing with. They're just trying to minimize risks and harms and find some possible benefits, primarily for the Canadian economy.
Michael Kovrig, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Michael Kovrig is a former Canadian diplomat and chief executive of Kovrig Group. Next up on the House podcast, the Liberal government's third attempt at reforming the bail system and a look at what really might be causing grocery prices to rise. That's after this quick break. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode. And tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. This week, the federal government put forward its plan to fix problems in the bail system. The changes aim to make it harder for some accused to be released while awaiting trial. The question of who gets bail is deeply personal for Michelle Best. In January, her daughter Kelly Verwey was killed in a daytime collision caused by an alleged impaired driver. The accused was wanted by police for violating his bail conditions.
Our daughter was killed by a person who was out on bail. And while that sounds simple enough, the accused had been out on bail and back through the system 3 times.
Even after being arrested in Kelly's death, the accused was once again let out on bail and sent to a treatment center, which he then left without permission. Best says he was out for 4 or 5 days before being rearrested.
We just need our judges to get a playbook. We need some hard and fast rules. We need perpetual violent offenders to stay in jail until their trial date. And I get the whole innocent until proven guilty, but I guess my big question is how many times, though? How many times do we get to make the same mistake and not have to wait to answer for our mistakes?
She says better laws could help save lives.
I don't want another call like that, and I certainly don't want anybody else to have another call like that. It has shattered our family.
The new legislation put forward by the Justice Minister this week is designed to make it harder for some people to get bail, like repeat or violent offenders and those charged with crimes like violent car theft, home invasion, and human trafficking. The bill cracks down on a few other areas, too, introducing consecutive sentences in certain instances, ending house arrest for certain sexual assault and child sexual offenses, and folding in new aggravating factors where crimes against first responders or harm to essential infrastructure can be met with harsher sentencing. The government is also aiming to clarify guidance to judges and police around what's called the principle of restraint, something the Liberals pursued as an instruction for judges to ensure someone is released at the earliest opportunity. Now, they want to clarify that principle doesn't mean people must be released. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre believes what the Liberals have put on the table doesn't go far enough.
Today's bill does not get rid of liberal bail, and that means that there will be a lot of very serious and rampant offenders who will once again be released into our streets, often within hours of their most recent arrest.
Others are concerned the new law could go too far. Jay Herbert is a criminal defense lawyer in Rama, Ontario, and a member of Rama First Nation.
A lot of my clients face pre-sentence custody, which is very difficult. A lot of people don't understand that provincial prisons are often overcrowded. They face frequent lockdowns. They're now facing what they call triple bunking, where you have 3 people to a very small cell. I was just this past summer involved in an inquest where a client was diagnosed with an infection while in custody and ultimately died because that infection went untreated. All of that before he was ever found guilty of an offense. I think what we need to focus on is solutions and not solutions related to bail. If you have no data that tells you that bail isn't actually working, how can you make a proper solution? What we're seeing here instead is we see people who are going through the system and end up becoming recidivists because they're not actually getting support. You have people who are addicted who don't get any treatment. You have people who have suffered trauma who aren't getting any counseling. And oftentimes they end up coming back to the court in what we call a time served scenario, which means that they've served their sentence in pretrial custody and then they're released. And these people are released without any plans, without any support, and oftentimes no more than a bus ticket. And so if you have people who have suffered trauma, like most of my Indigenous clients, or who are impoverished, like many of my clients, they have no support, no housing, no food, no plan. And when they're left with those situations, they become desperate. And oftentimes that's when we see recidivism, when people are desperate. And so if you don't deal with the underlying issues of addiction and trauma and focus on how we can help these people rather than house them in jails, you're not going to get any solutions.
So, why is this question of fixing bail been such a difficult one for the Liberals to solve? And why is the government confident this plan will work? I spoke with Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, Sean Fraser, on Thursday, the day he tabled his proposed law. Minister, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you.
One Liberal minister passed a law on bail in 2019, then another in 2023. Now you are here making more changes. Did the previous Liberal government, of which you were a part, get it wrong on bail?
There's things that we've done under the previous government with the legislation that you're referring to that remains part of the law of Canada today, which is important and effective, including in making it harder, for example, for people charged with intimate partner violence to be released on bail. But there are steps that we didn't take that perhaps we should have at the time. Since I've come into this position, I've spent an awful lot of my time speaking with law enforcement, dealing with provinces and territories and other community organizations to understand what more we can do. I'm confident with the steps that we put in place today and signaled with the validation by law enforcement and provincial governments across Canada that we've taken a huge step in the right direction. We will need to see these laws implemented with appropriate resources from other levels of government, but they have been good partners to collaborate in the development and will continue to be good partners to help them see through the implementation.
You say perhaps we should have done some other things, but the consequence of that is potentially that people got out on bail who perhaps shouldn't have been and perhaps committed crimes. Are you concerned about what this period over the last few years has done on the bail issue to Canadians' confidence in the justice system?
Well, look, one of the reasons that we've taken some of the steps that we have is to recognize that in addition to promoting public safety in communities, which is our primary concern. We do have a responsibility to engender faith in the administration of justice. There are different governments that have different responsibilities. We obviously control the text of the criminal code, but when you look at what may or may not have happened after previous legislation was adopted that included some measures that move things in the right direction, but perhaps could have gone further, you're going to quickly find yourself playing a fool's game. We have an opportunity to advance laws that will promote public safety and to work with law enforcement and other levels of government to ensure that those laws are implemented. I do have a degree of confidence that we can inspire that public faith in the justice system, both with the introduction of the legislation today, but seeing differences in how it's applied in the months and years to come.
The Conservatives say the only way to end the release of repeat offenders is to scrap the principle of restraint. Is that something you would consider?
Well, that's it. Look, at risk of making a comment that could be partisan, that doesn't understand how the bail system works. It doesn't understand where the principle of restraint comes from. If you were to repeal the bill that codified the principle of restraint from a few years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision would still remain in the background. A more effective way to address the challenges that we've heard from communities about the principle of restraint is to clarify how it should be applied and what it means. What we've done in this legislation is to explain very clearly that it is not grounds for automatic release. And in fact, if the decision maker in the court, judge or justice of the peace, is not satisfied that the public safety imperative can be managed, they have grounds to detain that person. Offering that direction to the courts through a change in the language is a far more effective way to create the outcome that you're hoping to achieve, which is having fewer dangerous offenders on our streets.
You are also bringing in reverse onus for more offenses, meaning if someone has a criminal history and they're accused of the crimes that we listed earlier, they have to prove that they deserve to be let out. Now, one of Canada's most prominent criminal defense lawyers, Lawrence Greenspan, said this violates the constitutionally protected right to bail. He also said, quote, it disregards the presumption of innocence. This idea might be popular with the public, but does this move respect fundamental rights?
I take a different view, though I have enormous respect for members of the profession who may have their own points of view. We landed on these commitments in the election campaign that we've recently run and expanded them in the process of developing this legislation through conversations with the people who work within the justice system and who have the responsibility to manage the justice system. We've heard loud and clear, including from the Canadian Police Association, that reverse onuses for certain violent offences that are causing problems in communities is something we could do to help promote public safety. I should thank in particular my counterpart in Ontario, Attorney General Doug Downey, for his extraordinary level of collaboration in developing some of the specific policies around reverse onuses to ensure that courts will be relying on credible information that will clearly demonstrate a person won't pose a threat to the public safety before they make a decision to release them into the community. We have to obviously operate within the bounds of the Constitution and respect Canadians' rights, but my starting point is to take ideas in good faith from different partners, different levels of government, different parties, and as long as they're directed at improving public safety in the communities that we live in as Canadians, then I want to figure out a way how we can include that in the legislative reforms we put forward.
Ideas are one thing, but measuring results is another. If you don't have national data around bail and people's past criminal history, how are you going to know if this works?
This is one of the most important questions, and I'm glad you asked it because it doesn't get enough attention. There is a paucity of data in the criminal justice system in many ways, but when it comes to bail specifically. Last week, I was with my colleagues, Minister Ananda Sangri and Minister Sahota, with every jurisdiction having an opportunity to be present, every province, every territory, with ministers of both justice and public safety to discuss what reforms we can put in place to promote public safety across Canada. One of the points of conversation that we'll need to continue is how we collect data about the bail system, how that data will shift as new measures are introduced. One of the challenges we have as a federal government, because we don't administer the bail system, is that we rely on provincial governments who have different data collection practices and I think, in my view, could improve data sharing in order to understand the impact of these different laws. The reason I'm optimistic is the nature of that conversation was one of the most collaborative federal-provincial meetings that I've ever experienced in my 10 years in politics. Provinces understand the nature of the challenge. They want to be good partners to help address the challenge, and they know that they have a responsibility, including on data collection, and we'll be willing to collaborate with them to improve the level of data collection and data sharing so we can actually measure the impact of the laws that we're implementing.
Without knowing the precise numbers, and of course we don't know what's going to happen in the future, it seems the likely outcome here is that there are going to be more people in jails. But part of the challenge is there isn't room. In June, Ontario's ombudsman said there is a growing state of crisis in the provincial jails, talking about things like double bunking, serious incidents where inmates were treated so badly that charges were reduced or dropped entirely. How confident are you that the provinces have the ability to manage more people being denied bail?
So this will be a challenge for certain governments, and the nature of this challenge varies as between provinces. Obviously, detention facilities are challenges in some provinces. Others have challenges around the capacities of the court. Others have inconsistent levels of community policing. And establishing best practices by working together is a great idea for the provinces. But I'm not here to tell them how to do their jobs. I have my own job that I need to do. And when I set out on the course of developing this legislation, the overarching question that informed every decision is, will the measures we're introducing actually going to have a positive impact when it comes to public safety? I don't want to adjust policies that would weaken the public safety response because there may be challenges with implementation as a result of a poorly resourced system. The answer to address a poorly resourced system is to put the resources behind the law so they can implement the law to its full capacity. I do have faith that provinces want to take action in this space. Obviously, there are fiscal constraints at every level of government, but my sense, talking to Canadians, is that public safety is not an area where we should compromise as a result of the cost, because the importance to Canadians is just so high.
We just heard from a lawyer who described an inquest that he was a part of because a client died in custody because of an untreated infection. All of this before there was ever a decision on his case. What would you say to that lawyer, the family of that man, about the worries around keeping more people in jail?
So there's separate but related questions that come up. And first of all, if you hear a story like that, you can only feel sympathy for the family who's been impacted, the individuals who've been impacted. We need to ensure that people have speedy access to a trial to determine whether they in fact should be incarcerated, whether they should be subject to criminal sentencing. Those are challenges that are related to the bail laws and sentencing changes that we put in place, but the solution operates in some ways independently.
You acknowledge that people don't necessarily have speedy access right now.
The delays many people are facing are a huge problem. I wouldn't just acknowledge it. I want to help solve that problem. We will have another piece of legislation coming through this fall that will specifically target delays in the justice system that will help complement some of the criminal law measures that we put in place as a result of today's bill. But the philosophy that I bring to this conversation is that we have to establish the appropriate framework that's going to protect Canadians and deliver public safety. The second question is how we resource the system to implement the changes that we're making. Those are related questions, but both solutions need to be part of the overall approach we take to ensure that people, with or without the dire consequences you flagged, to ensure that they all receive speedy access to justice. I have no interest in increasing pretrial detention without ensuring people have a resolution of the charges that they're facing in an expeditious way.
Mr. Fraser, thank you for your time.
A pleasure, as always.
Justice Minister Sean Fraser. We did also request the Conservative Justice critic to get his take on the new legislation. The opposition leader's office declined.
If you're that single mother out there walking down the grocery aisle looking at prices rise before your eyes, if you're that senior choosing between eating and heating, if you're one of the countless Canadians who see that roasted coffee is up 41% since the Prime Minister took office, that nuts and seeds up 15%, that food price inflation is now double the target, or if you're one of those 2 million people that are lined up at food banks every single month, the Prime Minister says you've never had it so good. How is it possible for this Prime Minister to be so costly and so out of touch with reality?
Here. Mr. Speaker, it's time once again for our economic lesson. Okay. Getting ahead means your wages grow grew faster than inflation. Let's look at the relationship between inflation and deficits. The inflation rate in Canada, the food inflation rate, is the G7 average, and we have the lowest deficit in the G7.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and Prime Minister Mark Carney trading barbs in question period this week over cost of living concerns as the overall inflation rate rose to 2.4% in this country. Food prices alone were up 4% compared to the same time last year. So what's actually behind this? What's driving up the cost of what you buy at the grocery store? Christina Caron is an economist who's been researching this topic for the Centre for the Study of Living Standards, and she argued in the Globe and Mail this week that one of the key drivers of higher food prices isn't getting enough attention. Christina Caron, welcome to the House.
Thank you very much.
You have been digging into the research around this. What is driving up food costs? I want to start by putting us into context. I mean, we heard some numbers there from Pierre Poilievre. People go to the grocery store, the prices feel high. Historically, what's happening right now in Canada? Where does it fit in? How bad is it?
Well, it's certainly true that food prices are going up faster than other prices. In fact, over the last 10 years or so, they've been going up about 50% faster than the non-food prices.
Wow.
So that is definitely the case, but it's also the case that that's happening in most countries right now. So Canada is not alone in that. And historically, food prices globally have been were trending down for many decades.
Okay.
And then they reversed course about 25 years ago.
Let's dig into some of what is fueling this then. We heard the Conservatives saying high food prices are the fault of the government. What do you see?
You know, we tend to focus on some of the shorter-term factors. The work that I've been doing really tries to link food prices and the economy more broadly to global developments and specifically to environmental developments. And what we see is that productivity growth in the agricultural sector has been going down globally, and that is largely linked to climate change. That's the single biggest driver of higher food prices, I would say.
So spell that out for me. What is it that climate change is doing right now to food prices?
So we're seeing much higher incidence of catastrophic storms, of droughts, very heavy precipitation, things like hail that can cause crop failures. And actually, we've had a number of crop failures around the world that have affected things like Brazilian oranges, Spanish olives, cocoa, for example, coffee prices. And the pace of these crop failures has been accelerating so that they're hitting us fast and furious, and it's causing spikes in the price of imported goods. And I should mention, it's not just imported goods, of course. It's also happening on the domestic level. So in Canada, drought in Nova Scotia has pushed up prices of blueberries as well. We had cold weather in the Okanagan last year, which pushed up the prices of peaches and plums and cherries. And we had flooding in Abbotsford, British Columbia, which killed a lot of livestock, raised prices of poultry and eggs for a while.
I do want to dig deeper into the conversation around climate change, but I want to stay for a minute with what Pierre Poilievre is saying. The Conservatives have been pretty explicit about this. They've been making this argument for some time. They say, listen, you have an industrial price on carbon, an industrial carbon tax. You tax something, it costs more. Therefore, this is driving up food costs. What do you say to that argument?
Well, I mean, we haven't had the carbon tax for a number of months at this point.
But the industrial price?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly one of many costs, but I would not say it's the driving factor, because if that was the explanatory variable, we wouldn't see similar things happening in other countries, and we do. So food prices are going up more rapidly than other prices in most countries at the moment.
So why do you think we are not hearing this part of the conversation so much then? Because certainly there's this political conversation in Canada that's happening around the question of taxes, and the Conservatives are really trying to push the policy. We hear the global conversation talking about things like the war on Ukraine, supply chains. I don't hear a lot of people saying climate change is at the front of this. Why not?
I think that's very true. I think we tend to focus on the shorter-term factors like the invasion of Ukraine, like COVID, like the tariff war. And those certainly all have a certain amount of impact. But the reality is that doesn't explain the fact that global food prices have been rising for the last 25 years. And when you look at the factors that have been causing that, the people who study agricultural productivity have clearly found that it's linked to climate change and higher incidence of drought, storms.
So if you were advising the federal government right now, we know there's a budget waiting in the wings. What are one or two of the most important things they could do if they wanted to try to address this?
So there's no quick fixes because obviously we in Canada cannot address climate change on our own. I think it's got to be part of a policy package, and I think we have to work with other countries to address climate change, to address biodiversity loss. There are a couple of things we could do. We certainly need to look at our management of fisheries because certainly fish catches have been going down pretty rapidly in Canada on both coasts, both east and west coasts. There's a few other things we could do too, looking at biodiversity loss, for example. We know that pollinator decline is another environmental factor which is driving reduced crop yields and therefore higher prices. And the European Union has banned certain classes of pesticide that are known to be damaging to pollinators. There's a number of those pesticides which are still perfectly legal and permitted in Canada, neonicotinoids specifically. That's something that we could absolutely look at because pollinator decline is another environmental factor driving higher food prices.
What would you say to individuals? I mean, it is in some ways discouraging. Well, not in some ways. It's discouraging to hear we've been dealing with this problem, and guess what? The challenge is one that is enormous in scale. What would you say to individuals who might feel a bit discouraged hearing your analysis?
It is discouraging, but I think we have to be very realistic. And if that's the key driver of higher prices, which I personally think it is, not just climate change, but other environmental factors, climate change probably the most prominent of those. And we have to keep our eye on the ball. So there's a lot of pressures right now. We're facing fiscal pressures, trade war, defense expenditures, many, many pressures, supporting workers who've been laid off as a result of tariff wars. I think we need to recognize that climate change is not going away, environmental issues are not going away, and they affect our prosperity. You can actually see food systems as the canary in the coal mine, almost leading indicator. So we're seeing the impacts on food systems earlier than we probably are in other sectors. But environmental issues are really having a significant impact on our prosperity, broadly speaking.
Christina Carroll, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Economist Christina Carroll. Okay, that is it for us this week. And make sure you check out next week's show, too. We went to Shawinigan, Quebec, to spend some time with former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He talks about what Trump wants from Canada, what he thinks about some Albertans wanting to separate, and whether that province will get a new oil pipeline. It was a fascinating trip, and I hope you can check it out. Our crew on the house is Kristen Everson, Emma Godmere, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plante. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.